We're going to move on into, in the last segment you saw this hypothetical about speech codes. I'm going to give you the real life example, the corollary to that. So that hypothetical was an example of an actual speech code. It's a case that we had, college Republicans versus San Francisco State University. Now the college Republicans, they wanted to hold an anti-terrorism rally. That sounds like something pretty much everybody on campus to get around, right? Like, who's for terrorism, right? Well, apparently there are some people on campus that they're offended by an anti-terrorism rally because the college Republicans, what they decided to do was have some flags of terrorist groups, and they laid them out on the ground like Hezbollah and Hamas and things like that, and they laid them on the ground, they paraded over them. Apparently, on the flags, written in Arabic, was the word Allah, and so people were offended by them walking over that, and they complained to the university. The university started an investigation because they found out that there was a policy that actually that required every student to be civil on campus. Now, I think we can all agree it's a good idea and we should all try to and strive to be civil on campus, but we can't have the university determining what's civil and what's not civil because your idea of civil may be different from what my idea of what's civil, and if you're punished for that, that's a content-based restriction. Now, after 7 months, the university said they decided not to punish them, thankfully, but a 7-month investigation is a pretty onerous price to pay for speaking on campus. So the college Republicans contacted us, we filed a lawsuit, and we were able to change that policy at every California State campus. California State University is the largest university system in the nation. It has about 25 campuses. And now, because of their actions, everybody, all 500,000 students on campus at those California State universities are more free and don't have to worry about being punished for violating this speech code. You know, the entire idea behind speech codes reminds me, it really guts any meaningful concept of free speech. George Orwell captured the essence of what it means to have free speech when he said this: "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear." My all-time favorite speech code is from Penn State University. It says this: "Intolerance will not be tolerated at Penn State University." Apparently they don't get irony at Penn State, right? Honestly, when I see a ridiculous policy like that, just once I would love to be able to say something like this.
Mr. Madison, what you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine, but...
Now, that's what I would like to say to those universities when I see crazy policies like this. But since I'm an adult and bound by ethical rules and all, I just have to stick with writing a letter and asking them to change their policy or filing a lawsuit. But the thing I want you to remember is don't let universities silence you with speech codes that are trying to say you can't say something because of the content of your speech. The second thing we want to look at and the way that universities restrain your speech are through speech zones. So here's a hypothetical. A student group wants to walk around campus, hand out literature about the group, and share the gospel. But they find out that the college requires prior permission before engaging in speech anywhere on campus. And the college limits students to speaking in one of two small speech zones. So the question is, can the college do that? Can the college limit speech to one of two speech zones on campus, or can they require prior permission before speaking on campus? The answer is no. The college can't require you to get prior permission because it disables spontaneous speech. And it disables anonymous speech. And the Constitution protects both spontaneous and anonymous speech. So when you're looking at these policies, you have to look at, does the college have unbridled discretion? Do they have the right to determine who gets to speak and who doesn't? Because most of these policies that I see makes that determination. They get to determine who speaks and who doesn't speak. Now, colleges can impose what's called reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on campus. They can do that. So they could say, hey, you can't use a bullhorn to speak at 3 in the morning outside the dormitories. that's a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction that would apply across the board no matter what you're saying. But what they can't do is say, hey, you come ask us whether you can speak on campus and we'll let you know whether you can do that. They can't do that. That's not a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. And generally, restricting all student speech to 1 or 2 small speech zones on campus is unconstitutional. So what if the college allows you to put up its display, but they say, we're going to make you put warning signs up around it? So is that legal? And the answer is no. In fact, we just recently represented a Students for Life group at Miami University of Ohio. Students for Life group there, they wanted to put up a Cemetery of the Innocents. I don't know if you've ever seen one. It's basically crosses representing a number of babies that have been killed each day from abortion in America. So the college gave them permission, but they said, you know what? You need to put warning signs around this to warn students about this. Now, the problem with that is that's a content-based restriction. There were displays on campus all the time, and none of them had ever been required to put up warning signs. So they were basically putting restrictions on their speech, and they were forcing them to speak a message, compelled speech, which they didn't want to speak. Thankfully, Students for Life contacted us, and we filed a lawsuit, and the college agreed to modify its policy, so now nobody can be required to speak a message that they disagree with, and nobody can be required to get permission before speaking anywhere on campus. We also recently represented a Young Americans for Liberty group at Kellogg Community College. And that group, several of them went out to their sidewalk. They wanted to hand out pamphlets about their group. And they were approached by a member of the Student Life Office, and a police officer said, you can't speak here without permission. The students said, we believe that we do have the right to speak, and we're going to continue speaking. As a result, they were arrested and placed in jail for 7 hours, simply because they wanted to hand out the Constitution and talk about freedom and liberty with other students on their college campus. Thankfully, we were able to file a lawsuit, get those charges dropped, and modify this policy so now all students at Kellogg Community College can speak freely on their sidewalks without worrying about having to get permission from the university. So what can you do if you encounter one of these policies? You see it and you say, well, they're telling me I have to get prior permission. Well, we would encourage you not to give advance notice and don't get prior permission, because the Constitution does not allow them to impose these types of prior restraints on your speech. Now, I'm going to show you here, this is an actual copy or a picture of a speech zone at Cypress College. As you can see, it's a very small area. It looks almost like a parking space. Again, thankfully, that speech zone is now gone because we were able to file a lawsuit and challenge that. And we've actually challenged these speech zones across the country. And we have a 100% success rate against speech zones in the numerous lawsuits we filed because, again, these speech zones are unconstitutional. So the third way that colleges are going to restrict your speech is through an equal access. So here's an example. The student group you were a part of wants to bring a pro-life speaker to campus to talk about the topic of abortion. You apply for student fee funding. Student fees are fees that are in addition to tuition, that all students are basically paid, and those fees are used to fund student speech on campus. After the student group applies for funding, they find out that the college actually prohibits the funding of ideological activities. Now, just think about it for a minute. Pretty much any activity is ideological in some capacity, right? How can they make a determination as to whether something's ideological and something else is not? So you have to decide, can the college do this? Can they make funding of your speech, can they prohibit ideological activity? Again, the answer is no. That would be a viewpoint-based policy. In other words, they have to determine what is your viewpoint, and then we'll determine whether we can fund you. And that's an unconstitutional restriction on funding. Student fee funding policies must be viewpoint neutral. So they cannot ban political, religious, or ideological speech because, frankly, if you've ever been on a college campus, you'll see pretty much all that speech is religious, political, ideological, and they are having and they fund that type of things all the time. So what can you do to challenge fee policies? Well, first of all, if you're going to challenge a policy, if you've got a policy on your campus that says we're not going to fund your type of speech, what you have to do in order to challenge that is to actually apply for funding. So don't just allow that to be a prohibition to you. Go ahead and apply for funding if you want to bring a pro-life speaker to campus. And then if you're denied, contact us. We would love to look into it to see whether that policy violates your rights. Now, this hypothetical is an actual hypothetical of a case that we filed last year against Colorado State University on behalf of Students for Life. Students for Life wanted to bring a pro-life speaker to campus. So they applied for a diversity grant. Now, this sounded like a great thing, right? Diversity grant. Hey, that's a good idea. And the purpose of the diversity grant was this. It was designed to support programs that enhance the educational and cultural aspects of the university community and raise the awareness of differing perspectives. Sounds like a great thing, right? In spite of this purpose, the university denied the funding of Students for Life because the speaker was, quote, not entirely unbiased on the topic of abortion. Yeah, no kidding. That's the purpose of bringing a differing perspective to campus, right? They also said that folks would not necessarily feel affirmed in attending the event. Again, no kidding. That's the purpose of a diversity grant, is to hear a differing perspective. Of course they may not feel affirmed. That's the purpose of a marketplace of ideas. They actually denied them for that. So thankfully, Students for Life, again, contacted us. We filed a lawsuit. You know what happened. We won, all right? So you'll see how this usually works. Like, you get a policy applied to your group, they call us, we win. That's just typically how it goes. I see let's take a couple questions on this last topic here.
All I do is win, no matter what. Got money
The next question, are speech zones fairly common? And do they seem to be more common at liberal schools? Unfortunately, they are very common. They are becoming less common because, frankly, we've had a lot of success at challenging these policies, both through litigation and through demand letters. So they're becoming less common, but you'll find them across the country. I mean, I filed one at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, so right in the heart of Midwest. We've challenged them in California. We've challenged them in New York. NC State had a policy that actually wasn't a speech zone, but it actually prohibited, it required permission before engaging in speech, an oral speech with any passerby. And they actually enforced that against a Christian student group. Now, of course, they weren't enforcing that across the board. It would be impossible because you'd be like, hey, did you go to class today? Sorry, man, got to have a permit for that, right? But they only enforce it where they want to enforce it. So they are very common, but the good thing is, again, when you challenge them, we have a very high success rate at winning. Finally, the final question is, University of Michigan. There was recently a lawsuit filed against the University of Michigan to challenge what's called a bias response team. Like, that's amazing. You think about this, a bias response team. You think of like this team like holed up in this basement, and they got their suits on, they're ready to run out, anytime somebody's offended. These are adults, right? And they're on campus, and they're just waiting to rush in and help somebody who heard something that they didn't like. But that's a frightening thing, and it's real. And so the question is, will this lawsuit prevail? I've read the complaint. I don't know all the details, but in general, a bias response team which allows the university to impose a punishment as a result of you offending someone else, that would be unconstitutional. They can't require you to be civil on campus. They can encourage that, but they can't do it at the pain of punishment by the government. Thanks. Those are great questions.